Hello everyone, Emmerron here. So, this week on How to GM, I wanted to cover something that, yet again, maybe I should have addressed earlier in the series here. So I remind everyone at this point, this 7th video in the series, these are not necessarily meant to be watched in a particular order. And again, I'm probably going to need to add that to some of the descriptions in the earlier videos to make that very clear to any of you who are watching this from the middle. So this week I want to talk about Session Zero. Now, those of you who come from other tabletop games into Cyberpunk, you may not be thinking that that sounds like a crazy thing. You probably are familiar with the concept of Session Zero. You've maybe been at one yourself. However, especially for those of you who have not seen Session Zero at the tables that you have participated at in the past, for games ranging from D&D to, Lord of the Rings to whatever, if you have never participated in a Session Zero, then that term might confuse you. And if you're a new player overall, or an aspiring GM who maybe doesn't really know either how to lead that or what it is to start with, this video should, with any luck, kind of clear some of that up. So let's first talk about the basics. What is Session Zero? So Session Zero is a kind of a pre-session, right? It's not typically done as like a regular gaming session like the rest of your gigs or your quests are going to be, depending on the game you're running. It is primarily a level set kind of session where the GM and all of the prospective players for a campaign, this is especially true of these longer campaigns like the one that I run for Neon Inferno, where you get everyone at the table together. You get all the people who will be participating in that campaign in one place at the same time, and you talk through some of those things that we maybe experience in avenues of our life, like getting a roommate, right? So when we equate it to that kind of a process, let me maybe use that metaphor for a little bit, because I think it's a useful one for explaining what a good Session Zero is supposed to do. So when you move out from living with your family for the first time and you move in with someone that, you are probably not a romantic partner of, you're just kind of two people living together, even if you've known each other beforehand, like maybe you were friends in high school and you move into an apartment together because you're going to the same university, for example. The two of you, usually the first good step to doing a successful living together in that post adulthood kind of phase of life is sit down, you write out what's called a roommate agreement, where the two of you talk about what boundaries you have, what behaviors you find acceptable and unacceptable. You find the things that are sensitive to each of you, so as to make it such that when one of you is, say, studying, the other is not acting in a way that is overly disruptive to the other one. Now, these are living documents. They are not intended to be we know week one all of the things that are going to piss each other off. And that aspect of it is open to discussion, right? In that same way as two roommates living together, you and your players are going to be occupying, if not a physical space, at the very least a mental one and an emotional one together at your table over the course of potentially years. I know there are a couple of rare campaigns, I've been in one, that literally last for years as the players, the GM, all of you kind of grow up together in a sense. In some cases, very literally. And this leads to the group having obviously changing sensibilities, expectations, etc. over time. And much in the same way that you would modify the roommate agreement, sometimes those expectations also will have to change. But session 0 is built to be a baseline. It's built to say, here's where we're starting from. What are the topics that we maybe don't want to cover in this campaign? Or if we are going to cover them, let's hold them at arm's length, right? What is typically referred to, I've been told, as veils and lines. It's a term for the process that I've only recently become aware of, but the practice is something I've been doing for quite some time, just under a different set of maybe descriptions that I would use for it. So the concept of veils and lines is simply this. A line is quite literally a line that you don't cross, right? So that might be a sensitive subject. That might be a topic which is traumatic for a player at the table. It may be something that is just a kind of interaction, right? That player is not open to. A really good example of something that I had come up in one of my games is my wife and I have played at the same table before for certain games. And I usually, being the GM, am in a very different kind of power dynamic over the table. As funny as that sounds, right? We're married. So we are in many ways equals when it comes to the way that we relate to one another. But within the context of that table, my power dynamic is in a kind of a different place, right? I am meant to wear all the hats in the game. She is meant to wear one. And so when it comes to the way that she and I interact over the board, we had an interesting situation come up where her character's ex came back into play, and they had this like rekindling that was kind of directed by me, but not entirely. But we got to a certain point in this like interaction that was kind of happening one-on-one between us, where I very much am taking, like, I'm a GM, I'm running the NPC as I think the NPC would behave. I don't have a personal horse in the race where, you know, like, oh, we're getting all flirty with each other. It's like, no, I'm not flirting with my wife. I am an NPC flirting with my wife's character. So there is a delineation in my mind when I'm doing that. My wife, on the other hand, is sitting there as one of, I believe there were 3 or 4 other players at the table, all of whom we knew, right? So these were not strangers. These are friends of ours in real life. But they were all sitting there online with us and hearing me do this. And they had expressed after we had discussed this, like, they were not bothered. It was simply my wife who viewed the whole scene as I was flirting with her. And she was like, oh, why are we flirting with each other in front of all of our friends? Like, that's weird. And I'm like, I didn't view it that way. So this is a great example, right, of we did not discuss that line before the game started. This was a ways into that campaign that we were playing. But at the same time, it was a line now that now going forward, if my wife is part of the game, I know to respect that boundary and only get so far down that rabbit hole before stopping, right? And so it's helped me kind of, you know, balance out how I do things. And it lets me know where I would not be valued, right? If I do something like that, where it might be potentially maybe harmful in some ways. And at the very least, it's uncomfortable, right? So obviously I wouldn't want to do that to my wife. I wouldn't want to do that to anybody, but like least of all my wife. So circling back to the core issue, a good session 0 is where any lines that are known by players ahead of time and any lines known by the GM, because the GM can absolutely have lines and veils just like the players can, those get discussed in the open between the table. And it gets well understood between the parties, or it should be well understood at least, what the consequences are if an expectation or a boundary is set and gets violated. So especially in a thing like what I run, where Neon Inferno is a live production and we are going every single week in front of a live audience online, this concept gets really, really important, right? It's much more important even than if we were doing this just a personal game amongst friends as a table or online over Foundry like we do. We are doing in front of people. So now those boundaries and respecting them becomes all the more important, because now I'm not just respecting my player's boundary or they mine. We are also acknowledging that there are other people in the audience that may have that boundary, right? To disrespect or violate it would not just be doing that to the person, but to any persons in the audience for whom that might be true as well. And that is obviously not something you ever want to do as a live entertainer. So this becomes, as you might imagine, like an incredibly important session, even if no gameplay happens, right? So in a game like Cyberpunk, most especially, this becomes important because dark themes are very readily available in the game, right? They are very easily delved into. They're very easily found. They are very easily explored, and it can lead to the players having an experience which is by and large very intimate in a discomforting way. If it is not uncomfortable, it should be disquieting, right? Knowing that you are grappling with either some form of mental illness in the form of cyberpsychosis, or that death and violence are very easily found, right? Like you can die very easily in the game. Violence can be thrust upon you, and you can thrust violence upon others very quickly. And we get to a place where we risk potentially going too far, right? Like a GM mindful of one of their players having a line against gore might not describe a death as viscerally or vibrantly as one who has no players for whom gore is an issue, right? And I've had both kinds at my table where I will describe something in very, very exacting detail. But if I know a player's there for whom that would be a trigger, I'm not going to do that, right? So let's talk about veils now. So lines are like the hard lines. You do not cross them no matter what. You don't bring them up. They're very like sacrosanct boundaries, right? Veils are those gray areas, right? Like when we cross a veil, we don't always know how far along we are until we fully cross through it, right? So a veil is the idea of there is a topic for which someone is maybe not entirely put off by it or made uncomfortable or triggered in a sense by it, unless it goes too far. So another way to put it that I kind of discussed with another GM in the community, Diamond Dust, is these are topics for which you hold them at arm's length for a player, right? So maybe, again, in my earlier example of violence, if they are triggered by gore, but not by violence at a nutshell, right? That's the arm length. That's the veil, right? You only hold it out as far as they are comfortable with it. And then once you know their boundary, you don't cross the boundary, right? And so that is another thing that gets discussed in session 1, or session 0, I should say, right? That first gathering between you and your players. So going one step further now. So let's say you and your players, you have this discussion together about all the things you do and don't find comfortable, and that, you have an agreement now of like, okay, if this happens at a table, I want you to signal me somehow, right? And that can be anything, right? That could be, I want you to halt what I'm doing and say, hey, GM, I have an issue with what was just done or said. And I will know that to mean, okay, let's stop, let's assess, right? In a live environment like the one that I play in, that could mean that, okay, guys, we're going to cut to break. Me and the players need to discuss something that just happened because there was something that crossed the line. So we'll be right back. And then we cut to our break screen or whatever, and we talk about it, right? Because that discussion doesn't necessarily need to be a public one, because it could be very personal, right? Obviously, we want to respect that. And at your own table, it might look like this, right? They signal, GM, I'm not feeling comfortable. Can I take you aside and let's talk about that for just a moment here? Because I feel like we didn't talk about this in session 0. and I need to add a line. And it's like, okay, cool. Yeah, let's go. Let's talk about in another room or something briefly. And the rest of the players can just kind of like take a moment, drink some water, whatever, while we go talk about it. And there is some trust, obviously, that you have to have with a GM to have those conversations, right? You as a GM should be open to playing that referee, especially if you're a GM whose game delves into the darker side of topics, right? You should not be afraid to have those kinds of difficult conversations if you want to use difficult topics in your game. That is something that is incredibly important to know, right? If you're not sure that you could have those difficult conversations with your players, the best advice I can give you is to avoid using those difficult topics in the first place. Because if you don't, there will come a time where a player comes up to you and says, GM, I have a problem with that. And you've got to be really willing to hear them and not take it as an ego check, as a, feeling of I am wrong or they are wrong in the worst case scenario. Like I am right, they're wrong. That is not part of that discussion, right? Even in session 0, when this is initially being discussed, you don't get the right to say that a player is wrong for feeling a way that they feel. If they tell you there's a line, respect it. If they've got a veil, know not to go too far down those rabbit holes that they're identifying as veils for them. There is something incredibly important that we have to have as GMs in terms of a sensibility for that kind of thing and a sensitivity to it. And it is probably one of the more challenging aspects of being a GM if you don't have a great gauge empathetically for what the people around you are maybe feeling. Because sometimes the tell can be a really subtle one. It could be a difference in the way that someone talks following a difficult subject getting brought up or being experienced around the table. It could be something like the player has to take a moment where they mute themselves or deafen themselves, or step up if you're at a physical table, they walk away for a little bit. These are all good tells for you to check in with that player when it's appropriate later and just say, hey, I noticed you get up and walk like into another room, or hey, I noticed you muted and maybe stepped away for a little bit there during the session. I just wanted to check in, make sure that everything's okay. Like, did we go too far? Was there something that I, said or did that made you feel uncomfortable? Always having that check-in conversation in those moments, because the player in the best case scenario is just going to come back and say, oh, I just need to stretch my legs, or oh, my cat was making chaos over in the corner of my room. I had to get up and I need to go deal with it. And that could be all it was. And it was inconvenient timing, right? But in the worst case scenario, something did happen and now you've addressed it to a degree, right? And players, if you are playing at a table with a GM who is not good at these things, it is not a problem or wrong, even if you know that GM is like a friend. It is not wrong if the GM is not willing to listen to your concern, to tell a GM, hey, I think I'm going to step away from this game. There's some subject matter that I know I've talked with you about, and I'm just not feeling like this is a good fit for me or good for my mental health. These are serious subjects that I really don't want to explore in a fantasy setting because I've experienced them plenty in my real life. And so I'm going to step away. And that's fine, right? Know your boundaries, respect your own boundaries enough to back away when the time comes. Because, we're supposed to be having fun. At the end of the day, tabletop games are fun. They're supposed to be a good time. Even when the dark subjects come up, they should be a dramatic thing that we are experiencing together for the sake of the drama, not traumatizing each other over the table for something that should be a hobby, right? Trauma does not have place in a tabletop game outside of the kind of goofy trauma that I talk about on stream sometimes with my friends, where you drop a gas bomb on them in one campaign and the next they're all wearing nasal filters. And now that's the problem, right? They are designing their character because they know I have an affinity for gas bombs. It's like, all right, well, that's, obviously that's a kind of trauma that we want to create at a table. You want to make the players think, oh, he's gonna do that again. They're gonna do that thing again. They're gonna bring back that old bag of tricks, and I hate them for it. I don't want to die to that again, and so they're going to build against it. And that is the kind of fun that we want to have when they get into those highly opposed, very tense situations. The takeaway should never be, I never want to play at this table again. It should be, damn it, the next time I play at this table, I'm going to make sure I have the countermeasure to whatever the hell that just was on my sheet, because I'll be damned if I let that get me again. So that is the only kind of trauma that we should be having in our games. So hopping back from that topic, because that's the heavier end of a session 0, right? The other side of a session 0 is to work out familiarity with the tools you'll be using. So for those of you who play around a table, there might be an expectation that you have like a physical grid or something in front of you. And so sometimes it's good to tell your players, I'm going to run Theater of the Mind. I'm going to run with a battle grid. I'm going to play with a very limited battle grid. We're going to maybe just do wet erase markers on a large rollout map, grid map that we're going to just draw little features on or whatever. And like, that's going to be the basics of it. I know that plenty of even professional grade GMs that maybe now use these very detailed, artistically rendered environments that most of us are just like, we're nerds that just salivate at the thought of having that at our own table. They'll be the first ones to admit that they start by and large with these rollout mats with doodles on them as the basis for their worlds, right? Matt Mercer, great example. He's literally talked in an interview before about this, that they, just in the first campaigns of Critical Role, they would roll out this mat across the table, just draw on it, say, this is where a tree is, this is where the bridge is, this is a river, here is the wagon you've come across, and like, here's the goblins that are attacking you, right? Like, that all is just represented by like some very low poly, just doodles on a map. And that's fine, right? That is where we all begin, because that is cheap, that is accessible. It doesn't require you have like, oh man, we're in a city, but the only tiles I have are like meadow tiles. Whoa, that's really bad. I'm not gonna have the right like environment. That's fine. Plain tan battle grid that you draw on with wet erase. Perfect for every occasion, every environment. So that's where I'd say, like, if you especially are coming into tabletop games as a hobby on a budget and you're like just kind of figuring out how you want to do this, if you're going to be in physical space doing stuff, the rollout wet erase mat, cannot recommend that enough. It is just a great tool for any new GM, I would say. If you are online like me, there are similar kinds of tools you could use. I believe Roll20 does, I believe, have a free trial, or at the very least like a free mode that's a little more limited in terms of like what you can do on it. But I know personally my favorite virtual tabletop is Foundry. It is going to cost you a little bit of money in the form of a license. I believe a lifetime license for it is $50 or $60, but it is lifetime. So once you have it, as long as your computer can support being the server for your game, or if you can afford, in the case you can afford to rent out a cloud server or something that you can host your game on, this can let you, set all that up and have something to run off of. And then it's just a matter of, finding the battle grid that suits you the best, because there's plenty of free ones online. We see them posted in the Cyberpunk Red subreddit all the time. I see them in some of the discords, like RTG's Discord, all the time. Some of the books and other game supplements for Cyberpunk Red come with battle grids, courtesy of Loki Battle Maps. All of these are great resources. All of these can serve you very well if you are just like, I want to play the game, but I am on a budget. Like, there you go. This is how you solve it. Expanding on tools. So once you've decided if you're playing Theater of the Mind, if you're playing with a tabletop board or a virtual tabletop that gives you that representation, now we can talk about, if a player is unfamiliar with how to play in that space, right? Like maybe like most of my players were before Neon Inferno, they're used to you running in a Theater of the Mind setting. Well, now everything in the theater of the mind setting is highly extrapolated. It's very different than when you're playing with a physical grid in front of you that you can push a token across and say, okay, I am moving a distance. I am fighting this guy over here. I can see him. I'm cover here, whatever. You know, like when you have a grid that's all very well defined, in theater of the mind, it gets a little muddy, right? And you and the players have to negotiate a shared understanding of the space that you're occupying, right? So that is something where maybe it is a good idea if your players are at all unfamiliar with the environment you're going to be playing in, such as Foundry or, you know, Theater of the Mind, to run a small sample something, right? So one of the things I typically like to use is that there is a gig in, I believe it's in the Jumpstart kit for Cyberpunk Red, that is called Just Like Real. And there is basically the setup for the gig is this. A police officer, I think she's like a captain or lieutenant, comes up to you and says, I have a training sim that I need to run for some new trainees at the academy. There's one in particular who's got a huge ego, really need to take him down a notch. And so she asks your Edgerunner crew if they would be willing to basically be the hostage takers in a raid simulation for these trainees, to make them aware of like how dangerous it can be when you go into a hostage situation with a bunch of edge runners, right? So what I did is I just kind of took the hostage simulation of that and just ran that section of that gig as a standalone thing, because it involves a little bit of combat. It involves a little bit of like situational awareness of like, okay, where are we stowing this hostage until the cops get here? You know, you have to kind of do all of that. And so it gives your players a sense for when I'm running a game and the stakes are higher, where it's not just a simulation, how am I going to run this thing? How am I going to resolve things? If you're unfamiliar with the game to begin with, right? If you are just a new player, full stop to the setting, this is also going to serve as a sort of tutorial to get you familiar with, you know, how does skill check resolution work? How does it work when I am, you know, taking cover? How does it work, you know, if you want to destroy cover? All of these things can kind of be demoed within the context of something like that. So I do like doing that as part of my session zeros. It is a bit optional because obviously if all of you are experienced with the game, then it could just be a simple conversation of, okay, let's talk about the things that bother us, the things that don't bother us, what we're doing if something does bother us, and what the consequences are for not respecting that. And then what tools and such are we using and how is that going to look at this table, right? Because one GM might use a different set of expectations too that they've homebrewed to make their life or the lives of their players easier in some way, or at the very least more accessible, depending on if they have like a player maybe who doesn't work a certain way or think a certain way for, you know, a rule or resolving certain things. Like they might be trying to accommodate the player by running the game maybe a little differently than you're used to. So these are all good ways to kind of level set those expectations and get everyone on the same page. So I do think that is it now. So I hope you all found this useful. Again, my name is Emmerron. If you found this video helpful, please like, subscribe, and comment below if you have any additional perspectives. I always love hearing from you guys in the comments below and getting your perspective on things. And I know session zeros are incredibly important, and I believe that they don't get enough time in the sun. They are undervalued, I think, a lot of the time, where players will walk in and just expect things to work. And then when they don't, they're, you know, they got the shocked Pikachu face. They're just like, why didn't it work? Well, because you didn't talk about like what wouldn't work. You know, that's the foundation here. Since we are exploring very sensitive topics together, we should all know what we're getting into. So that all said, I hope all of you have a wonderful morning, evening, or afternoon, wherever you are in the world. We all stay healthy, stay safe, and until next time, we'll see you very soon. Peace.